Welcome very much to our event today, Building a Diverse Profession. This event is co-sponsored by the Stanford Center on the Legal Profession, the Black Law Students Association, Women of Stanford Law, and the Stanford Center for Racial Justice. My name is Joanna Grossman. I'm a professor at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas, but I'm also teaching gender law at Stanford Law School this spring, and so that's why I'm involved in this event. And I'm also a Stanford Law alum of many years ago. So we're here today to talk about building a diverse and inclusive legal profession. It's also Groundhog's Day, which those of you in California, I know that doesn't mean much to you because the weather never changes and who cares whether a groundhog sees his shadow. But it's actually a fitting day because diversity and inclusion in the legal profession is a problem that seems a little bit like we never solve. And if you remember Bill Murray in the movie Groundhog's Day, he wakes up every day at the same time trying to tackle the same problems. His problems are not our problems, but he has that feeling of, when is this going to end? Why do I wake up every day feeling like I'm starting at ground zero again? And of course, if you remember the movie, Bill Murray can't break out of this trap until he has an epiphany and stops being quite so selfish and sees the world in a new way. And more importantly, until Andie MacDowell sees him in a new way. So our story might not be exactly that, but I think what we're looking for is, what is that breakthrough that is going to help us finally change the legal profession so we don't wake up every day thinking, still this issue? In 2015, the Washington Post observed correctly, statistically, that law is the least diverse profession in the nation. And lawyers aren't doing enough to change that. And the lack of diversity and inclusion is evident by a number of different measures. But for me, the most telling is the pyramid shape of advancement in the profession. So women, for example, have been 50% of law school graduates for about 20 years, but only 18% of equity partners in law firms. Lawyers of color are 22% of associates, but only 6% of equity partners. And women of color are the least represented of all, comprising only a little under 3% of equity partners. And the lack of vertical equity is not the only way of measuring diversity or inclusion, and law firms are not the only place in which we might measure how the legal profession is doing. But both of these give us a way of focusing on this persistent and sort of intractable problem that reflects really a much deeper set of problems, everything from bias, structural inequities, complacency, power dynamics, a resistance to change, all kinds of things. And the Groundhog Day lesson, as I said, is something has to give, something has to break so that we can wake up to a new and more inclusive day. It's also Black History Month, and Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "Change does not roll in on the wheels of inevitability, but comes through continuous struggle." And that's a quote I come back to a lot in my work, which is that equality is not inevitable. It is possible, but not inevitable. So our panel today is three amazing people who are part of the struggle for a diverse and inclusive legal profession. And I know many of us are thinking today about Deborah Rohde, who did so much during her long and storied career to expose the magnitude of the problem and to work towards a more inclusive world. So I'm going to briefly introduce our speakers today, and then we will both have some time for opening remarks and then questions. So first we have Shauna Johnson-Clark, who's the Global and US Chair of Norton Rose Fulbright and the head of its employment and labor practice. She's the only woman of color to be the chair of an AmLaw 200 law firm and has led the firm's diversity and inclusion efforts. Sandra Simpkins is the director and co-founder of the Children's Justice Clinic at Rutgers Law School and a nationally recognized expert in juvenile defense. She's worked to expose the challenges for women in public interest careers in a world she calls the pink ghetto. And Joseph West, finally, is a partner in Dwayne Morris's trial practice group, as well as the firm's chief diversity and inclusion officer. He currently serves as the vice chairman of the ABA Council for the section of legal education and admissions to the bar, which for the students with us is very important because it oversees law school accreditation and, more importantly to you soon, bar admissions nationwide. He's also worked with the Minority Corporate Counsel Association, which is an organization that has produced great data over the years that I both quote a lot and rely on a lot. So I appreciate that past work as well. And I will say that all three of our panelists, in addition to their incredible expertise, would do very well in Room Rater with their very nice backgrounds, well balanced. Maybe that's a metaphor for what our profession could look like if we put thought into how it could be structured. So what I'm going to ask is for each panelist, and I'm going to begin with Shauna, to give us maybe 3 minutes of kind of opening framing, in which I just ask you to share with us, how do you think about this issue, diversity and inclusion in the legal profession? What are the things we should keep an eye on in our minds? How would we know when we were making progress? You can pick sort of what angle you'd like to go, but just to give us a sense of your thought from your particular background and experience. And Shauna, if you don't mind, I would love for you to go first.
Sure, thank you. And thank you very much for inviting me and allowing me the opportunity to participate on this panel. And I'll tell you, Joanna, you touched upon something that strikes me when we talk about the diversifying the legal profession. I think we should absolutely clarify that we're talking about big law and, you know, in-house, and of course we'll hear from Sandra with respect to you know, our public law. But from what I see, the profession outside of big law and Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 companies, the profession is fairly diverse. I mean, it's particularly when you look at criminal lawyers, I see people of color representing plaintiffs across the board in various facets of life, from family law to probate to what have you. So, you know, I don't see that the profession is non-diverse outside of big law and, you know, Fortune 1000 companies. But if we're focusing there, and I would challenge all students, law students, to make sure you define success for yourself. And if your definition of success includes a career, and I can speak from big law, or working for a Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 company, then there is a significant amount of work to do. And I wholeheartedly agree that it's Groundhog Day. When I started at the law firm in 1994, having clerked for 2 summers at was then Fulbright and Jaworski, there were maybe 8 to 10 Black lawyers in the litigation group. And then you fast forward to 2021, and that number there is a fraction. So there's actually been some regression in our ability to recruit and retain talent in that particular area. Although I'm very proud to say that with respect to the partner level, we've been very deliberate and we've seen a significant amount of success. Whereas I used to be the only African-American female partner in the law firm, we boast now of 3 African-American women in the law firm. And I know, and our numbers are better with respect to people of color, but considering this is Black History Month, and when we look at the statistics, and you hear that 3% of partners, women of color, are in big law, for African-American women, that percentage is less than 1%. And so it is abysmal, the track record among the law firms. And I've been committed, at sometimes violently committed, to making change in the firm. But the most important takeaway for me is creating a firm culture environment that allows folks to come in and be as close to their authentic selves as possible. I am not one of those people who believe that making partner in a big law firm is the holy grail. I believe that there are positions, very important positions in careers at big law, that is not, you know, that's different from your typical equity partnership. That's not for everyone. But But if it is for you and you are a person of color or a woman, then, you know, it's our job to do everything that we can to make that opportunity, you know, a real one for those individuals.
Thanks so much, Shauna. Sandra, can I ask you to go next?
Yes, yes. Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here. So what I think it's important to focus on for students is the kinds of gender stratification in the legal profession. As you mentioned, what we know is that women have made up half the law school population for nearly 30 years. And you mentioned the stagnant progress that we've made in some areas. And I think that, you know, part of the problem could be the norm of women doing public interest work. And you can see incredible gender stratification there. We know that this kind of stratification for public interest women begins with law schools across the country that have intentional hierarchies that keep those who do public interest, primarily women, at the lower end of the law school hierarchy. And the reason public interest is so problematic for women is because it is not valued by the profession, not only by the law school, but by the profession writ large. And I'll talk more about that later. But I want to challenge how we think about public interest and pro bono a little bit. And while it's extremely important work, it may not be good for women.
Terrific. Joseph?
Yeah, so thank you, first of all, for having me. I'm honored to be here, particularly with the my fellow panel members. Joanna, your work I'm a fan of as well. I just ordered your book, 9 to 5. I can't wait to read it. Sandra, I know one person who was tapped by the MacArthur Foundation one time. I don't know anybody who's been tapped multiple times. So kudos to you on that. And Shauna, my fellow Tulane alum, I've been a fan of yours for many, many years. I don't think I've had the chance to congratulate you on your ascendancy to the ranks of leadership at your firm. So congratulations on that. I'm very proud of you. My perspective will be similar to Shauna's, having spent the bulk of my career in either a large firm or in-house at large corporations. And I think it's important to note that there have been a number of organizations that have been sort of toiling in the vineyard around diversity and inclusion for a long time before it was fashionable. The National Bar Association, the Hispanic National Bar Association, National Asian Pacific American Bar Association, ABA initiatives with the Commission on Women and Disability, Lavender Law, and other organizations. But I think where we are right now is that we see a confluence of factors, not just those external affinity type organizations, but also general counsels. And the thing that we know in big law is that client demands pretty much drive everything. And you see not just sort of those outlier firms like Walmart and Microsoft and others. I spent 5 years at Walmart when they were very active in pushing the envelope around diversity and inclusion. But you actually see a large number of, you know, Shauna mentioned the Fortune 1000, not just the big firms, the big companies, but even smaller companies, those GCs who are in starter home GC jobs at the lower ranks, who are really using their influence, flexing their muscle, and I think encouraging their firms to take this issue more seriously. And I think that's resulted in greater sort of fluency around diversity and inclusion, and that's translating into action.
Thanks. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to ask a couple of questions and then we will open it up and I'll take questions through the Q&A function from the audience, and then I will repeat the questions to you. So what I wanted to start with is we're obviously talking about diversity of different types. The three panelists we have and the intros you've each given sort of focus on gender and race and ethnicity, which are both independent types of diversity, but also with obviously overlap and intersectionality. And so I wonder if we could start in the law firm context. I want to talk, this question is for Shauna and Joseph, and you could do whatever order you want. That one of the ways that race and gender intersect in the law firm context, I think, is in how we imagine who it is that should be a partner, who it is should be in charge, who it is that should be in Shauna's job, the top person in the firm. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about whether that has played a role as an obstacle in your careers and ascendancies to top positions, or whether you think you see that as a problem now, and what are some ways to change people's perceptions of who leaders are. And like I said, you could go in either order. If you want to switch this time, maybe Joseph go first.
I was going to defer to Shauna.
Yeah, I know you were gesturing up to the corner, but
I'll take a stab at it, Shauna, if you're okay with it.
I am absolutely.
Thank you. So when I became the CEO of the Minority Corporate Counsel Association in 2011, one of the first things I did was establish what we call the Academy for Leadership and Inclusion. It was an implicit bias training program for our corporate law department and law firm members. And the reason for that is because so much research showed that implicit bias was one of the most intractable problems. One of the main reasons why you didn't see as much, you didn't see people like Shauna in the leadership ranks at large law firms. And what you find, I really think it's important for us to note that at various sort of choke points, these junctures in the career trajectory, whether it's recruiting, whether it's compensation disparities, whether it's the assignment of work, the evaluation of work, the mentoring and sponsorship that happens that allows people to sort of grow their careers so that, you know, as you go up the food chain, the air doesn't thin out for women and minorities. You know, even when, how, and under what circumstances people are separated from organizations, bias plays an important role. And that is at the heart, really, Joanna, of your question, which is what leadership looks like, what our perceptions are. And if organizations aren't willing to do the work in identifying bias and how it has an impact in the policies and practices and procedures in these organizations, you won't see that happen. The other thing I will point out, you know, Shauna is not just the chairman or chairperson of her firm, she's also a member of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee. And I think what that shows is that there is greater currency in the diversity and inclusion space. You know, in 2012, you had 3 Fortune 500s that had a chief diversity and inclusion officer. Right now, today, 3/4 of the Fortune 500 has a chief diversity and inclusion officer. And in most of those instances, they are C-suite level positions, which means that position, that work has been elevated and recognized as a core business function of the company. And so those two things taken in tandem, recognizing and identifying barriers to inclusion and elevating diversity and inclusion to the importance that it deserves, I think are really two things that are really important to happen right now.
Thanks. Shauna?
And thank you, Joe. I agree wholeheartedly. And I'll answer the question from a different, but a more pragmatic, personal perspective with respect to what clients and juries, who they expect, the lawyer who's leading the matter, what do they expect that person to look like? When I was, you know, all these years ago, when I first started out, my then boyfriend, he's now my husband, when I would be introduced as a very young lawyer, as the lawyer for the company, right? And because I'm an employment defense lawyer, so I'm representing the corporations. And I would walk in as the lawyer, and we would call the phenomenon sticker shock, because the clients routinely would look and it's like, but where's my lawyer? And it would happen in front of juries too, when I was very young, when I would stand up to announce ready on behalf of the corporation and not the plaintiff, you know, I could see the sticker shock. And that's very real. That has improved, but every once in a while, it occurs to me. And your question, Joanna, is what do you do to overcome that bias, that visible question as to this can't possibly be my lawyer? And my answer to every single law student listening, and to my son who's also listening, it's just be great. That's all, just be great. And I tried this case. It was a Black woman was the plaintiff. I represented this huge medical system. And we took a verdict, we poured her out. And I went to talk to the jury because I always want to get constructive feedback, always tell me how I can be better. And there were two white males who one I knew would be the foreman. Both were managers, a defense lawyer's prime, jury. And he asked me, he walked up and he said, "Did they hire you because you're Black?" And I gave him a side, head tilt. And this was 15, maybe 20 years ago. And I asked him, I said, "What do you think?" And he said, "When you walked out, it crossed my mind until you started to speak." And that's it. And I said, "And there's your answer." And so it happens. We all have our perceptions of what the doctor looks like, the preacher looks like, the head of a law firm looks like. That's just being raised in a country that will have these negative and positive stereotypes, and in a profession that is largely white male dominated. But that's just the beginning of the question. That's just the beginning of the story. My response to that is always simply just be great. And so I had the luxury of being ignorant of imposter syndrome. I didn't learn that was a thing until I was talking to a woman, and she said, because I had such a horrible case of imposter syndrome, and I was like, "What is that?" And she's like, that feeling where you don't feel as though you're good enough, that everyone else and around you was just better, and that they're going to find out that you're a fraud. And let me just be clear. I went to LSU undergrad, and I'm proud. I'm a proud Tiger, and Tulane Law School, very proud of that. But it wasn't Stanford Law or Columbia or Harvard or Yale, and yet it never crossed my mind, not one single day, that any of the people in my class above me or below me were better than me. And in fact, I had to remind myself what the Bible says is don't think more highly of yourself than you ought. So for me, yes, I received I was often the paralegal, or I was the assistant, or I was the court reporter. I'd come in as a deposition. I mean, that just happens. I never took that personally. And it's my response to it is just be great. And greatness has a way, performing and delivering results is the great equalizer. The problem we have is giving people like me the opportunity to be great. I was fortunate. I was lucky to have a sponsor who made certain that I had the opportunity. I had the at-bat. I was able to represent the client. I was first chair in trials. Not everyone who looks like me. In fact, I am well aware that I am the exception in that. Not just Black women, but people of color, Black men across the board are denied the opportunity to be great. But if given the opportunity to be great and you be great, then that sticker shock, it to me now, it's whenever it happens, it is so rare. It makes me feel young again. Like, oh, okay, I'm
It's like getting cardio.
Maybe I still look like I'm inexperienced or whatever. But anyway, I am a glass 3/4 full.
Right.
And so you have to really go out of your way to offend me.
That's great. It reminds me of a famous old Stanford Law School story, which is Barbara Babcock, who was the first woman assistant attorney general she was appointed by President Carter, and she was called up after her appointment was announced by, I don't remember if it was the New York Times or the Washington Post, and the reporter said, "How does it feel to know you were only picked for this because you're a woman?" And she said, "A whole lot better than it would feel to not be picked for it because I'm a woman." And that was the end of that.
That's the end of
your
that.
story sort of remind me of that old story. So Sandra, I want to give you a question for you, which is what we've been talking about is working in a context in which ascending to these top positions is not necessarily something we associate either with women or with people of color due to all the things that Shauna and Joseph have talked about. But you write in the Pink Ghetto that actually in the public interest world, the normative female lawyer can actually be a problem, that when you do the thing that is exactly what we expect women to do, that comes with its own set of challenges and risks. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your perspective on that.
Sure, thank you so much. So, I just want to say that any profession that is primarily staffed with women becomes a problem like this, a pink ghetto where there's less status and less compensation. And I'm sure that we can come up with lots of examples in our own minds of those kinds of places where there are a lot of women. I have to say, I've spent my entire career as a public interest lawyer, and I've been in many national venues, and I never, ever thought about being a gender stereotype until 2018. And suddenly I realized I'm in the female area of juvenile law, in an undervalued area of public defense, within an underpaid field of public interest. And the reason it took so long for me to recognize this is because gender segregation, particularly within public interest, is never talked about. And so what I want to talk a little bit about is that public interest is not valued by the profession. And so going into this field can be a challenge for women later on. We see that public interest is not valued by the profession most clearly in law schools. And I talked a little bit about that already, that there are these divides, these hierarchies. And so when female law students begin law school, they immediately see and feel this gender stratification. They enter a profession in an environment that tells you this is normal, this is where you belong, in these lower level, underpaid, caregiving roles. Before doing this program, I had an opportunity to look at the statistics from Stanford Law School. You have a wonderful clinical program. And in looking at, who is staffing your clinical program, it lined up exactly with what I wrote about in the article. 75% women. And my information, the most recent information I had, is that there is still that divide between clinicians and the doctrinal faculty. Clinicians are at the lower level. In addition to public interest not being valued by the law schools, by the ABA, it is also ignored. For years, the ABA has marked the progress of women in firms and other areas, but there's been no reports or attempt to document public interest women. And as we all know, this kind of lack of data has an enormous impact. Not only does it keep women in public interest invisible, it also reinforces the message that these women shouldn't be focused on their careers. Which brings me to my next issue, which is that there are many factors within public interest culture that creates challenges for women. As we all know, many public interest organizations are perpetually underfunded. And when you don't have enough money to hire lawyers to serve your client base, you tend also not to have enough money for conferences and networking opportunities, which means career advancement opportunities are going to be extremely limited for women who go into these fields. In addition, there's this thing within public interest organizations where we're completely client focused, exclusively client focused. And while that, of course, it's good to be focused on your client, women need encouragement to focus on their own careers. And often, again, in public interest organizations, unlike firms, there is not a specific encouragement for women to be thinking about their own careers. And then finally, public interest reinforces the role of women as caregivers, and frequently uncompensated caregivers. It's not my intent to discourage women from public interest. Rather, I just want to raise awareness so that women can make more informed choices about how they proceed in their career.
Thanks. So I'd like to talk, Joe, if you're willing to talk a little bit about your in-house experience. I know you mentioned that you worked at Walmart. And obviously I mentioned that you had been involved with the Minority Corporate Counsel Association as a former president. I wonder if you could talk a little bit, and Shauna, you may have reflections on this too, about how well some of the pressure coming from corporate clients, how well that's worked to get law firms to diversify. I know the law firms talk about it a lot and the corporations talk about it. And I wonder if from either of those perspectives, you have a sense of whether that's Maybe you could describe what I'm talking about for the students who are listening, and just talk a little bit about your sense on the ground of whether that's been a useful tool in diversifying legal teams.
So, Shauna, do you want to go first this time?
Sure, Joe. I'll speak from the law firm perspective, because you have that in-house perspective as well.
Especially at a company like Walmart, which was very much on the stick end of the carrot stick continuum.
And so I have questions for you, because I will tell you, on the outside looking in from the law firm perspective, I'm encouraged that going forward, we're going to see change. We're going to see a measurable difference in the number of successful women and people of color. Corporations have had diversity and inclusion targets and requirements and guidelines for years. And the issue I saw with them, and I think remain, is that it was very superficial. It told the white male partner who received all of the managing the matter origination. For law students, he received the credit, the dollar credit. It told the white male partner that it was good enough if you had a woman or a person of color, or even better, a woman and a person of color on your team. Doesn't matter that those two individuals may have received 1 hour of credit, 1 hour of work. It's so long as you put the bios in the packets, then we'll check the box and it's all good. That was the first issue I saw. And I'm blessed to work with clients who did the opposite with me and my career and what I'm trying to do. If we want to see change, if we want to see more women being successful, more people of color being successful, more Black people being successful in an equity partnership, then we need corporations to give just what I said before, those individuals the at-bat.
Yeah.
Yes, hiring me to handle your small matter, thank you. I appreciate it. I appreciate every single hour that a client sends to me. And I tell my people, any matter that a client sends to this law firm is important to the client, so it's important to us, whether it's driving down to Beaumont or going through documents in a box or whatever. But that's not going to make or break my career. My career was made by those, and I'll say this, white men who hired me as a third-year lawyer to try my first case, that gave me that opportunity to either fall on my face and get tattooed. Tattooed means getting a horrible verdict, or be great. And that's unless and until the diversity initiatives actually expect that. And it's not the law firms who are making the decision. Clients drive this. So when the client sends the work to Shauna Clark to handle, good, bad, or indifferent, I am going to trust that you are going to handle this matter and you're going to deliver a great job and you're going to speak to the board. Success breeds success. So, Joe, you can talk to the stick, but in my experience back in the day, and I would receive those metrics, all I had to do is, what percentage are women? 100%. Right. What percentage are Black? 100%. Great. But that's because I'm the partner, and sure. And I'm very deliberate about the people who work on my team. And I have never been, and I am proud to say this, and this for the students here, it's like, duh, but I don't believe in window dressing. And right. I have never allowed anyone to use me just because I'm Black or just because they're trying to get a number, et cetera. Now, I bring value, I believe, to every team I'm on. And my partners have always recognized that, and they recognize that part of me, that if I don't have a meaningful role to play, then I'm not the person to ask to just help you get this particular piece of business. But again, I've been blessed to have a sponsor who allowed me to be not openly disrespectful, but I could set my standards. But that's unless and until the corporations do that. Give people of color and women the at-bats. She runs the deal. She right. tries the case. She gets the credit, or he gets. credit. It's not going to change.
Let me address both your questions by giving specific examples of how and when that has happened. So I was recruited to Walmart by Tom Mars. Tom was the general counsel. He was named general counsel in 2004 at Walmart, and his charge was to upgrade the legal department. Walmart had grown so quickly, it sort of outstripped its infrastructure in the legal department. They needed both bodies and horsepower. They just needed to be bigger. They needed people with certain skill sets and experience commensurate with the fact that the company was no longer a regional concern tucked away in the Ozark Mountains. It was a global Fortune 1. And by pure happenstance, Tom attended an event, I believe at MCCA, and he had, his words, not mine, an epiphany. He was exposed to a large number of women and minority lawyers, LGBTQ lawyers, and he didn't realize that there was this wealth of talent out there. And so he went on a recruiting spree, specifically at affinity bar events. And in the space of about 18 months, the department tripled in size. It went from 11% minority to 23%. It went from something like 15% female to 43%. And an interesting thing happened on the way to the forum. The department got better. I mean, the internal business scores by Walmart's business clients went through the roof because, you know, the concepts of diversity and inclusion and excellence aren't mutually exclusive. In fact, they're interdependent on each other. And then the company turned its attention to the ranks of its outside counsel because overwhelmingly, to your point, Shauna, the relationship partners were just overwhelmingly white males. And so what the department did was it got rid of all of the relationship partners, all 600 firms, 25,000 timekeepers, started from scratch. And we started requiring that every one of our firms submit a list of 5 candidates. At least one had to be a woman, one had to be a person of color. And in an 18-month period, it shifted about $60 million worth of work to women and minority relationship partners and women and minority owned law firms. And Shauna, to your point, around that time, I was promoted to the head of the global outside counsel management function. I was responsible for managing the company's relationships with all of its outside firms. One of the things I noticed is that a lot of the origination credit was still going to the old origination partner. So I went to Tom with that and he said, okay, you've pointed out a problem. What's the solution? And I said, we should start requiring the firms to certify in writing that the relationship partners we selected are receiving origination credit. Because the fact of the matter is this, the coin of the realm, the currency that everybody understands in large law firms is who's got the relationship with the client, who benefits financially from that relationship, and the extent to which that relationship benefits others in the firm, which gives you gravitas, and is it portable? If you leave the firm, is that client going to go with you? And so we added that portability component. And look, that has, I think, allowed Walmart. I left the company when in 2011, but they're a client of mine now. Thankfully, I kept good relationships with the company. It's one of those companies that puts their money where their mouth is. I'll name some others. Microsoft, Brad Smith, who's the general counsel and president at Microsoft. I mean, his approach was decidedly on the carrot end of the carrot stick continuum. I mean, Microsoft does something very creative with their clients. I mean, Brad actually incentivizes his direct reports. He establishes diversity metrics for them, both with respect to their own departments, as well as the utilization of outside counsel. And a portion of their annual bonus would be withheld every year if they don't meet their metrics. And I had a conversation with Brad once and I said, Brad, how many years have you been doing this? He said, oh, 5 years. I said, well, how many years has somebody missed their bonus? He said, just the first year. Just the first year, because it clarifies the mind when you tie it to money. And the other thing they do is with their outside counsel, they will give them a sweetener at the end of the year if they meet certain metrics, both in the utilization of their of the lawyers they put on Microsoft Matters, as well as their overall numbers. They get like a 2 or 3% bonus on top of what they bill and collect. And what you see is, again, I mentioned at the outset, there were a lot of sort of outlier companies that were doing these kinds of things. But there are a lot of companies now that are being more creative about this. Yeah, the ABA published a letter a couple of years ago, an open letter from 170 general counsels, basically saying, look, get serious about this or you will lose our business. Bradley Guyton, who was a general counsel at Ford, he just became the GC at Coca-Cola, and he published a letter
Yeah,
that basically says exactly the same thing. The Coke letter, it's kind of floating around out there.
it's going around.
Yeah, if you just type in Bradley Guyton Coca-Cola, you'll see it. Kim Rivera, who was the general counsel at Davita when Kim became the GC at HP, she did something similar. And again, what you see now is that companies are no longer just paying lip service to this kind of thing. They really are making decisions about quality decisions around how they spend their money. I'll say this and then I'll stop. Ironically enough, I think it was the last economic downturn that sort of facilitated and germinated this movement because at that time, 2008, 2009, I think corporate law departments became more discerning consumers of legal services. They realized that they had the power to expect certain things of their outside counsel. The other thing that happened is that a lot of firms laid people off and that talent went in-house because corporate law departments realized, look, there are certain functions, certain subject matter or geographic areas where we can do this work ourselves. And so let's take some of this talent that's out there in the marketplace, a lot of which happen to be women and minorities, and utilize them. So they learn the value of diversity in a real and meaningful way, almost completely by accident. And so the confluence of those two factors, seeing the realization of diverse talent and how well it works in-house, as well as becoming more discerning consumers of legal services and knowing that you have the bully pulpit, you can expect certain things of your outside counsel. That's resulted in what you see now is this willingness of general counsels to say to their firms, hey, do this or else.
Thanks. So I'm hearing in all of your comments is a couple of themes. One is that accountability can play a very important role, and that can look like different things. What you're describing just now, Joe, is right, a new approach to accountability coming from the corporate client. And that's really interesting to hear sort of both your two different perspectives on sort of how that operates. And then a lot of you, all three of you have touched on data and metrics and ways of thinking about where the problem is. I forget now which one of you talked about choke points. Maybe that was you, Joe, but that one of the things we've done wrong, maybe historically, is not focused enough on metrics, right? Where are these opportunities going? How do we make sure that Shauna's getting the opportunity to be great, which she obviously did at every turn. As a former Tulane law professor, I'm proud to hear that also. And Sandra, you sort of talked about some of the more structural problems that are channeling certain students maybe into careers where they're not getting some of the opportunities that we might like them to see. So maybe if we could sort of, before turning over to questions as they come in, how do we create both either the accountability or the opportunities that we really seek? Is there one thing, anything that we haven't talked about that you think would be something you'd really like to see more focus on in the future for the folks coming into the profession? They're going to have fresh eyes and fresh ideas. What do you want them to see? What do you want them to focus on that might mean 20 years from now, we're not having exactly the same conversation? Sandra, maybe you want to go first?
I'd like to see the law schools change some across the country. As I mentioned, I do think that it sends a really a negative message to the women who come in when there is that stratification. I have been told that Stanford does not have the kind of divide that many other law schools do, which is terrific. And I know that law schools are moving in that direction, but I do think removing hierarchies in law school is a good place to start. And then I just want to come back to data. I think that, some places have a lot of data. I think that there's a lot of people watching progress in large law firms, but not so much in other areas, and a more of a focus on that.
Donna?
I absolutely agree with what Sandra said. And as far as the data, uh, when we had conversations years ago at the global executive committee level, and we talked about diversity and inclusion, and now it's diversity, equity, and inclusion, because you could have diversity and inclusion and still be inequitable. But I challenged the law firm at a global level then, and I continue to today, to broaden the definition of diversity. Because, and I'll say this, Joe, and you can comment, for the longest time, when corporations spoke about diversity, it was geared towards women and increasing women representation. So much so, when we talked about the statistics, where the percentage of Black women in law firms was not even tracked, not measured. And the same held true in corporations and in law firms. And so when we talk about making progress in this space, if you are ashamed to even measure it, then that just speaks to the problem. And from my perspective, unless diversity includes not just women and gender, race, ethnicity, not just LGBTQ, not just religion and age, but having that definition be as expansive and as broad as possible, then it's not authentic. And we're not talking about numbers. It has to do with more than that. And recruiting for the sake of recruiting, and I'm all for bringing in, over the last year, I told my people, the entire firm, that in addition to everything else that I do, my focus will be particularly on the recruitment and retention and sponsorship and promotion of Black people, because I've not done enough in that space. And I had to, the issues of last year, I had to confront that person, that in all of the good work I was doing, sponsoring a rainbow coalition and being proud of it, I was not proud of the work I did not do for Black people. But when we look at being authentic, and if you want to make change, then there has to be the hard work of confronting, unconscious and conscious biases, and having those conversations, and just making sure that everyone is included. And someone had the comment about why we shouldn't place the work or the responsibility of progressing people of color on the shoulders of people of color. And that is absolutely right. It is requesting or challenging the person who has been most, and this is an emotionally charged word, forgive me, victimized, the victims, to offer the solution. And that's never going to happen. It is never that's you just, the powerless will not change the power without some type of, some action.
Right.
Either violent or non-violent, and I'm all about non-violent. So anyway, there's some work to be done, but it absolutely starts with recognizing the problem, the issue. And if we can't measure, if we are ashamed to confront the fact that less than 1% of equity partners are Black women, then that speaks to, we are never, if we don't confront that and not just that, all of the percentages that we know we need, that needs work. But if we can't confront it and identify it, then there's no hope that we're going to ever make any meaningful difference there.
Totally.
I'm going to turn it to you, Joe, in just a sec. I just want to put a plug in for, and I know some of you have been involved in this, but the work that the ABA Commission on Women, the Minority Corporate Counsel Association, and a couple of other entities have done in terms of tracking data over the years and doing studies and surveys and reports has been enormously helpful to me as a researcher. But I want to put in a plug for continuing to press your professional groups to
absolutely
part of that accountability prospect, because I think it's really been incredibly useful in a way that one firm or one company can't do, but those associations. So and Joe,
I'm glad you mentioned that. I mean, I happen to be one of two men who, I serve on the ABA Commission on Women, and I would point people to the Bias Interrupters study that was jointly
Fabulous study.
exactly by the Commission on Women and MCCA. Actually, I worked with Michelle Coleman Mays, the former GC at Allstate, who's now the GC at the New York City Public Library, and Joan Williams, who is the head of the Center for Work-Life Balance. The three of us actually worked when I was at MCCA to get that study off the ground. I would also point out Paulette Brown, when she became the first African-American female president of the American Bar Association, she put together an ABA 360 diversity commission, and the commission created a number of deliverables, buyers training videos, toolkits for law firms, for actually, public interest sectors, corporations. I would encourage you to check out ABA Diversity 360, and you'll see the full range of tools that were produced there. Just to the point you made earlier in the question about students, I would tell you, you mentioned that I'm a vice chair of the Council on Legal Education, which oversees bar admissions and law school accreditation. There are standards, I don't know if people are aware of this, that do have certain requirements of law schools around diversity and inclusion, both at the faculty and at the student level. We've recently had some roundtable discussions about considering whether or not bias training should become sort of a mandatory part of what happens in the law school setting. And I would just say, stay tuned and keep track of those discussions. A lot of the standards, there's discussion on various sides of whether or not they are effort-based or result-based standards. I won't go down that rabbit hole right now, but I would just say to you that I think there is a greater understanding of the need for fluency around diversity and inclusion and equity, particularly as it relates to bias. And I don't think that's going to change.
As a law professor, we shudder a little bit when we hear that you're throwing around some new requirements, and we should stay tuned. But I support this particular initiative.
Joanna, let me be clear. There are discussions right now.
Yeah. It'll be on Twitter before it ends up in any kind of formal setting. So a question from a student I wanted to, and I'm not sure who wants to answer it, but have you seen that intersectional problems that relate to caregiving? I know, Sandra, you talked about some of the overlap with caregiving responsibilities with the students and the lawyers who go into public interest. But Shauna, Joe, also, have you seen intersections where, for example, the family commitments of Black women have been treated differently or been harder to navigate, or whether that's something that is many women will have a very similar type of set of challenges?
I'll take this one, Joe. I don't think there's a difference between white women, Black women, women of color versus white women when it comes to the challenges that are faced when having a family and working at big law. I will tell you, back in the 90s, I would have as soon gnawed off my right arm before I told a partner I needed to be out for any reason having to do with child rearing. It didn't matter. And because it was just frowned upon. But the world in this space has changed. And I am ridiculously proud of the progress we've made. I think what students, men and women, who are going into the profession at big law and starting a family, it's just hard. The gig itself by itself is hard. And then parenting is hard. And what I've seen over the last 10, 15 years is that senior partners have daughters who are now working, particularly daughters who are working in law firms. And those men now are the biggest champions of women, and I love it. And I call them on it. Like, one of my best friends, when his wife was at home on bed rest and he had to leave the office every day at 3:00 to do all these different things, it's like, finally you understand what it's like to be the primary caregiver and work at this law firm, even as a partner. So it is challenging to do both. It just is. But now is an absolutely wonderful time to be a parent working in big law, because we have so much support. And no matter how horrible this pandemic has been and the effect and the trauma it's caused, the one silver lining that's come out of it is now we know that working from home, working mobily works. And the pandemic actually ushered us 5 years into the future when it comes to the question of whether or not she will be as productive at home versus in the office. And I don't think we'll ever go back to, and maybe I'm speaking about Shauna Clark, to going into the office 5 days a week.
I don't think we should underappreciate, though, the impact that those disparities have on women of color, particularly African Americans. I'll point out, I don't know if you know who Stephanie Scharf is, but Stephanie is a fantastic lawyer. She's a former president of the National Association of Women Lawyers. And NAL, as you know, would do an annual report every year. In one report, Stephanie was one of my outside counsel when I was at Walmart. She shared a report with me that showed that women of color, particularly African-American women, at some point in their careers, 90% of them will have caregiver responsibility for a collateral relative, whether it's a parent or some other, that other demographics don't have. And that the challenges that imposes on their career progression are real and meaningful and measurable. And so I think we shouldn't underappreciate how that might have an impact on people's career paths.
Well, and I agree with that. But Joe, I'll tell you, and I don't know that, my mother-in-law lives with us for 6 months. At this point, I've been doing this long enough. I have a lot of flexibility. I think the issue you raised is more complex than that, in the sense that Black women tend to be far, either primary caregivers and doing all of the work. And that's a different issue, because what we're seeing now with people at the law firm, there's elder care, that's an issue. And so there are so many different demographics in the law firm who are caring for those other individuals. And
the other stat, I hate to interrupt you though, Shauna, because that same study showed that 75% of the African-American partners, lawyers in the firm, are also either the sole or primary breadwinner in their house.
That's exactly right. So that's what I'm saying. There's that exactly. You just hit the nail on the head, and I didn't want to go into that whole primary caregiver, only caregiver, single. So that's a very complex issue. And I'm not, look, I know how hard it is. I just said that I was the primary caregiver, and I'm married, happily married, but still the responsibility for raising and rearing my children and my husband all fell on me. And there were many a times I needed a wife. Now I'm lucky enough to have one. Her name is Zamara, and she's lovely. And where I go, she goes. And where she goes, if she leaves, I tell them at the house, I'm leaving too. But that's a different place today than in 1998 when my son was born. And it was very, very difficult, but we didn't have the support. I mean, now North Fulbright, we have now offered like a concierge service. And this is, New York firms are like, of course, but to know that there's someone who would pick up my dry cleaning now. If
that
was
is
just
the exception. That is the exception, not the rule.
Yeah, I mean, there are all of this, the sick care, the in-home care. I remember cheering when we actually brought in the additional care, the support, just that if your baby was sick or the school closed or something, you had someone who was able to come in and help. And that's, again, 10, 15 years ago. So I'm not minimizing the effect that this had, this child rearing and has on Black women in particular. But I can be optimistic and say that we've come a long way, baby, on that part.
No doubt.
And Sandra, I wanted to give you a chance to, if you had a last word. We're getting to we're at the end of time notices. So.
No, I think it was covered really well. I think I don't have anything else to add. Thank you.
Great. Well, I want to thank all of you. This has been a really interesting discussion. I would love to talk individually with all of you. Because I think you have such different perspectives, both professional and personal, and it's really wonderful of you to share your time with us. And I have 3 sons. I know, Shauna, you said one of your sons was watching. I've got 3 teenage boys, and one of them, when he was little, he cried one day on Groundhog's Day. And what's wrong with you? He said, we didn't do anything to celebrate. And I said, what? Who celebrates Groundhog's Day? Okay, what do you want to do? And he said, I think we should have dinner that a groundhog would like as a guest. And that's what we did. And he got mocked endlessly by his older brothers, but we created this very inclusive table where, should a groundhog happen to show up at our table that night,
He would feel welcomed and included.
Feel very welcome included. And it's always kind of stuck in my mind as like a really kind of simple understanding, but very useful understanding of inclusion, which is we got to build the table. And all of you are doing so much work to make that happen, and to make these students who are watching feel hopeful, and to have Shauna's wonderful optimistic attitude. I might be your yang, if you want to be yin, I might be yang, but anyway, I just want to say thank you for your time, which I know is incredibly valuable, and we really, really appreciate what you've done for the community.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for including me.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Good luck, students. Study hard.
Stay safe.
That's the real challenge.
That's right.